We're going to try this again. I froze the last time I tried to do this, but the video is still brought to you by Diet A&W, the official drink of All for One Regime Diabolique and other fine role-playing games. I wonder if I should start getting an endorsement from that. But anyhow, I watched Brian's video on sending the troops today, and listened to Anthony's audio file where, I guess, in the actual RPG video response community, I believe it was, he was responding to something I think Rick had said about troop style play and whatnot. I don't see an awful lot from there, but it's kind of an interesting crossroads for me and my approach, and a lot of us have been talking about it lately in the Star Trek group I've been involved in, because this is a big part of that game. And as Brian was mentioning, how do you want how would we want to import this into other games in general that don't necessarily handle it that way? Anthony covered a lot of, I nodded in agreement with a lot of what Anthony said, because, of course, originally we had tons of retainers back in the Stone Age, and, often the game master would play them, but, over time, most of what really happened is the player that hired that particular person would play them as well, and the GM had some sort of veto power at some point. Okay, you can't use them as a meat shield and just throw them in front of you or whatever, or send them down the well to see what's going on while you stay up there and eat bonbons, that sort of thing. But over time, that evolved in the larger game community into like, well, hey, let somebody else play that guy, which is pretty interesting. The experience, that I still feel like we should do more in our All for One game, and it simply just goes slow because we don't necessarily get together all that often with our schedules and being, around the world. But it's been fun introducing the lackeys, and one of the neat things that game promotes is that like another player will play your lackey. And so you're not necessarily talking to yourself. It's a little interesting too because and kind of goes in the direction of Star Trek in one way, in the manner, if I can learn to talk, in the manner that it's not necessarily carved in stone that the same player always plays your lackey. Now that player could be in a scene with you. I could be playing Philippe Moreau. I could be in a scene with Francois playing Briscoe, but I could also end up playing his lackey at the same time if I needed to. But what's more fun is if my character isn't in the scene, and then I can play his lackey. Maybe I'm playing his lackey with somebody else's lackey, or maybe I'm playing Eugene with Briscoe. That can be a ton of fun, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be me, unless that's the way the group has decided it. That lackey, that secondary character, can be community property. And I was thinking about it as I'm watching Brian's video, and it reminded me one of the neat things about the game Circle of Hands. There aren't secondary characters in that game. You're supposed to have a troop of people that come along with you, but they're pretty much nameless, faceless support characters. To say, of course we have somebody that brought food. Of course we have somebody that's going to carry our armor and all that sort of stuff, because that's not what the game is about. But the pool of characters themselves, you don't get to play the same character every time. You create a couple characters. Everybody creates a couple characters. On any given adventure, everybody chooses a Circle Knight to go on the adventure with, but it could be one that somebody else created. And so those characters become kind of community property, which is not something I've had the chance to play yet, but something I'm really interested to do. So enter Star Trek, which has probably some of the coolest formalized ways for handling these secondary characters. And I reread the rules for that today, because I threw in a bunch of secondary characters into the last Star Trek game I played into, and to answer, I think part of what Brian was getting at, and I kind of threw it out there, is the way that game handles secondary characters is brilliant, because somebody should be here. Who are they? Give them a name. Let's go. And so you create a secondary character on the spot. So I believe I created 3, which I think is still within the limits of what the ship can actually, there's a whole limit for how many you can create and use in a specific episode. But I literally created, Ensign Abigail Ybarra, hopefully somebody gets that reference, to be man the transporters. We never used her. We decided not to use the transporters. We didn't have to at the last minute. Introduced Ensign. Now he's going to be Saparagossi, and kind of because every ship needs a Barclay, but an engineer to help my character. And it was not somebody that somebody else was going to play at that point, but somebody should be there. So I just invented that character. And at some point we beamed down to the planet, so we had to have a red shirt with us. So I nominated Jose, which from our Star Wars group, he was talking about wanting to play a red shirt anyway. So there's a character there now. At that particular point, though, when somebody introduces a character there, maybe you play them, maybe you don't. Maybe they're just a person that happens to be there, but they're available to play later on. I believe there's a codified way of what to do with those characters at that point, like how many, what are their stats going to be, how many points you get to spread around, and I believe what we didn't do. We're underusing that particular part of the game as we're simply learning the game in general. So we're going to bolt on more parts as we get better and better at become more facile with the game. I think it's a word. Anyhow, it doesn't matter. You know what I'm talking about. It struck me though in any case like that, and I've had this happen in other games which didn't have rules for this. At some point when somebody invents a character on the spot, you almost want to have another person documenting it. What's their name? Who are they? Because in the middle of that moment, you're creating the character. So somebody else should probably be furiously scribbling down who this person is so you can use them again. The neat thing about the Star Trek secondary characters was two neat things. The first one is they become more and more real the more you use them. If you introduce them again into another scene, another episode, then you get to add to their stats. They get to have things like values and focuses and all that sort of thing, and they become more and more real, which is in a very it's a very codified manner of what we did anyway. In a lot of old games, where you'd name the butcher at some point. Who's the barmaid over here? Who's this guy? Who's that guy? And at some point, if you kept on returning to them over and over again, then we'd add more personality. They would become more and more of a real person. And at the end of several sessions, all of a sudden you have a real fleshed out non-player character. The other neat thing is that at any given scene, and here's where we're really underusing it. If your character is not supposed to be there, or is just not there, you can inhabit one of these secondary characters that now is another crew person. You don't have as much. They're not as quite as cool and as exciting as your regular character, but you can do stuff with them. And I think one of the reasons that we tend to be underusing this right now is like people like Aloy and myself. We seem, I'm like watching Aloy thinking he's doing the same thing I'm doing. When we get so engrossed in what everybody else is doing and what the other characters are doing, it doesn't matter that our character isn't in that scene or isn't doing anything in that scene. We're very interested in the whole thing that's going on at the same time. And we underuse that moment. We're like, hey, I can grab this ensign over here, this crewman over there, and start playing them in the scene because, of course, there's other people around on a starship. That just makes sense. And now I have something to do. I can be much more engaged in the scene. The takeaway from all that into as Brian said, where else could we use it? I believe in as part of a culture of play, as part of something that you have to sit there and talk about. You can use that in a whole bunch of games. Probably one of the biggest impediments to doing that is that moment. I think it's just the history, really, of like people like probably like Aloy, like Jason, like myself. We've played for so long in systems where the game master just it was their job to control everybody else. And I'm not talking about a control thing. It's just that's your job to all of a sudden say, hey, you know what? Does it really matter if the player plays this other guy in the scene? Sometimes it simply doesn't occur to me at that point that hey, this two guys go over here. We've split the party. The other guy's staying at home. Instead of narrating that the wizard is going to sit there and work on his wizardy crap for the next 5 hours or whatever, why doesn't he play one of the other retainers? Why doesn't he play somebody else that they meet? And you don't really necessarily specifically have a plan for that non-player character. It would be kind of interesting, as Anthony said, in the bar in the Western where the people show up and they're going to have the showdown in the street, that the other players at that point, they're not walking in the bar, their characters aren't walking in the bar, so to speak. Play some of the other people around there, and take some of the burden off of the GM, and also, from a GM standpoint. I've had moments where we've done stuff like that, and it's a lot more interesting because these characters all of a sudden do things that you never would have thought of. I think the only other impediment that comes to mind with that is if you have a specific, if there's already created non-player characters in the world. Like I'll take the Lamentations in Prussia game, which it's hysterical. Somebody actually just posted on a bunch of the videos and said, hey, when are you guys going to play more games? So apparently they watched the whole thing, and it's engaging television. And so I was talking to the guys, hey, we wanted to play a little bit more. But at this point, Jason's stuck with, like, okay, who's he going to play now because his character is dead? There are some non-player characters that have been introduced as part of their troupe of people. They didn't bring retainers with them. They kind of picked them up in the rubble of another city. But there are these people that they're now interacting with. And I talked to Jason after his character died, and I said, well, some of these guys are on the table, if you want to play them and take them over. But there's that moment where you might have a non-player character as a game master that the players have now interacted with, etc., that has a secret, and that's not somebody that's on the table for them to take over, because they might have that character do things that are would be inappropriate. We encountered stuff like that in our All for One game, where we didn't set clear boundaries as we're sharing the GM duties and literally handing things over. In a kind of a weird way, we are doing this maybe backward style, troop style play where the whole stable of non-player characters gets transferred from one GM to the other. And there were some moments where our non-player characters did some very surprising things to the person that created them, because now the next GM had the whole stable, so to speak. And I in the last session, I learned from some of our mistakes and said, okay, I've got a kind of a bubble around this particular person. The bummer about that is, though, that's an immediate red flag that, hey, this person does have a secret, and maybe they are more than they are appearing to be. But overall, I can see that I'm underusing this in our Star Trek game. All of us are, because we're just new to the system. But there's a whole gold mine of stuff that we can do there. But that genre supports that, because of course you watch a TV show, you don't have the entire cadre of main characters assembled in every single scene. Of course you don't. But you have all these extra people around there that take on life of their own. Chief O'Brien becomes a real person over time, to the point where he has his own show. But other games, there's no reason you can't do a lot of stuff like that in other games, as long as you're willing to think outside the box as a GM and as a player. You don't have to, and the brilliant thing, the thing that does, and I've watched it happen in some games where we've done this, is you don't have to worry about, like, well, the whole party doesn't have to sit there and move as a group here and there and everywhere else, because that's insane. Unless you're on a dungeon crawl where it's necessary, everybody goes together in this direction or that direction. In a lot of other games, that's simply not what would happen. Now you're free as the player whose character is not going to go in that particular direction, that's not having the spotlight time, if you will, to play somebody else in the environment. Maybe they are playing a lackey. Maybe they are playing one of the secondary type characters that's allied with the group. But maybe, if we really kind of step back and say, well, why can't you play, this particular guy at the library, and maybe, as Brian shared that little ditty from Cobalt Press, maybe, as a GM, you can even like scratch on a 3x5 card. Here's a couple things about this NPC, but after that, it's all you. Here's his personality. Here's his kind of little motivation. But go ahead and ham it up. And we did stuff like that in a very different way. When I played with a old game, doesn't matter what the game was, but we came to some big battles where it was more like the GM didn't want to handle all these opposing forces, because it became almost like a war game for a moment. He goes, "Well, you play this army. You play this army," and that was a lot of fun. He just said, "Okay, this is what this army's like. Go ahead, boom," and we had one of those moments where it took a lot of the load off the GM, and we all got to remain engaged the entire time. So yeah, I think that's big. You could, as long as you discuss that with the other people there, I believe it's wide open, and I don't see a reason not to use more troop style play, more as Anthony said, generational play. I think it's a very underused technique in games, and it doesn't have to be limited to the ones where it's canon. But I think you can look at those games. You can look at something like Star Trek Adventures, look at how it does it, and say, hey, that's a really good idea. Let's incorporate that into our other game. Just like, now that I'm rambling, but here, in for a penny, in for a pound. Just like when you look at Star Trek Adventures and it says, here's these base stats the guy's going to have, and then over time you get to add more stuff. It's a lot like those, NPCs that I still use in something like, a basic fantasy or Lamentations of the Flame Princess, where they all have what are their stats? Well, it's all 10s. Until they become so important that maybe we need to figure out what their stats are. That sort of thing. Yeah, there you go. Chief O'Brien, the sitcom. You know, well, he didn't quite get his own show, but you know what I mean. He became a real character over time. So yeah, I think there's some great takeaways from things like All for One, Leagues of Adventure. The great takeaways from Star Trek Adventures, and things like Ars Magica, where it gives you ideas like, hey, we can do a lot more with this than just simply play these main characters, and have to have them all kind of chained at the hip, which, from a fictional standpoint, often makes no sense. So why not think outside the box? So, yeah, that's all I got to say about that.